You lie in a quiet room, candlelight flickering against rough wooden beams overhead. The air smells faintly of smoke and something sharper, something pungent, garlic, strung above the door in thick braids. You might laugh at it now, but to those who lived centuries ago, garlic was more than seasoning. It was a shield, a ward, a silent guard against things the eye could not see but the mind could not escape. To understand why garlic became so deeply tied to the fight against evil, we must step into the forgotten rhythms of daily life, where nights were darker, fears sharper, and the border between sickness and sorcery felt perilously thin. Before modern medicine, the idea that unseen forces controlled life and death was not superstition, it was survival logic. When a child grew feverish overnight or livestock suddenly sickened, people looked for explanations in the invisible. They believed illness crept in on the breath of demons, witches, or corrupted air known as miasma. The night was the greatest enemy. No electric lights, no street lamps, only the small circle of flame from a candle or fire. Darkness was thick, total. In that void lived wolves, thieves, but also spirits. If you were poor, you could not afford charms of gold or relics from churches. What you did have was the ground beneath your feet, and in that ground grew garlic. Garlic is one of the oldest cultivated plants, with evidence of use dating back over 5,000 years in Egypt and Mesopotamia. It had practical powers. Its pungent oils repel insects, and its antibacterial properties, unknown to early farmers, genuinely slowed infection. But in a world where smell meant safety, garlic's sharp odor felt like armor. The Greeks wore garlic at night to keep evil spirits at bay. Roman soldiers ate it before battle, believing it filled them with strength while warding off curses. In Slavic folklore, garlic was pressed into cracks of windows and rubbed on door frames so that witches and demons could not enter. The smell that now lingers on kitchen hands once hung in the rafters of cottages as a barrier against the night. Garlic even crossed into religious traditions. In medieval Christian Europe, priests sometimes blessed garlic during rituals to protect homes. In Orthodox regions, garlic was used during holy festivals as a sacred purifier. The belief ran so deep that to refuse garlic on certain nights was to risk your soul. And of course, garlic's most famous association, vampires. Bram Stoker did not invent this. He borrowed from centuries of Eastern European tales where garlic was thought to repel the undead. Villagers who feared that the dead might rise and wander at night buried their loved ones with garlic in their mouths, ensuring they would not return hungry for blood. For ordinary peasants, garlic was cheap, accessible, and multipurpose. It flavored the thin broth of the poor, it treated wounds, and it promised protection. In markets, braids of garlic were sold not only as food but as wards. A merchant might whisper, "Hang this above your bed, and no shadow will trouble your sleep." Travelers tucked garlic into their belts. Mothers pressed cloves into the hands of children who walked alone at dusk. It became part of daily routine, like carrying keys or locking a door today. Doctors of the Middle Ages prescribed garlic for nearly everything, from plague to toothache. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. But medicine and magic were not separate categories. To chew garlic before facing a sick patient was as much a medical precaution as it was a spiritual defense. The overlap was natural. When explanations fail, every cure is both science and spell. Imagine now that you are in a small wooden hut on a stormy night. The wind howls, and rain lashes at the shutters. Inside, smoke curls from a fire, but the air is heavy with a sharp sting of garlic hung in braids above the door. You listen for noises outside, for the cracking of twigs or the sigh of a spirit pressing against your walls. Garlic is not just food. It is the smell of safety, the invisible barrier between you and the endless dark. Why garlic? Why not rosemary, thyme, or some other herb? Perhaps the answer lies not only in its real-world properties but in its power to linger, to invade the senses, to remind people that something, anything, stood between them and the terror of the unseen. And yet, even as people trusted garlic to guard their homes and bodies, another truth was quietly forming. If garlic could protect, what could defeat it? Why did some believe that too much garlic might draw evil instead of repelling it? You already know garlic was more than food. It was a shield against sickness and sorcery, a barrier against spirits, a comfort in the dark. But history rarely paints a single, simple picture. For every belief that garlic was a guardian, there were whispers that it carried dangers of its own. Like all powerful things, garlic held a double edge: cure and curse, food and forbidden. In ancient Egypt, garlic was sacred. Workers who built the pyramids were fed garlic daily, not only to strengthen their bodies but to protect their spirits. And yet, priests of some temples forbade garlic within their holy spaces. Its strong odor was thought to disturb the purity of ritual. Similarly, in India's Ayurvedic tradition, garlic was recognized as both healing and unclean. Monks were often told to avoid it, for it was believed to stir passions and cloud meditation. Garlic could restore the body, but it could also disturb the soul. The paradox was clear: garlic was powerful, but power always brought suspicion. In medieval Europe, garlic hung over doorways to repel witches. But in some corners of folklore, garlic itself was considered a witch's tool. Too much garlic, some said, could draw the attention of dark forces. An herbal brew spiced too heavily with garlic was believed to invite demonic influence. There are records from the 14th century where inquisitors listed garlic among the herbs that could be used in flying ointments, the supposed mixtures witches rubbed on their bodies to travel at night. It is impossible to know whether garlic truly played such a role, or if fear simply attached itself to the most common plants of daily life. The rituals of garlic stretched across borders. In Eastern Europe, garlic cloves were carried in pockets as talismans against the evil eye. But here lies the contradiction. If someone was seen carrying too much garlic, suspicion fell on them. Were they simply fearful, or were they hiding something darker? In some Balkan villages, garlic was rubbed onto doors and animal horns during midsummer festivals, meant to keep away disease. Yet, at the same time, certain church authorities discouraged the practice, calling it superstition that rivaled the power of holy water. This tension, between garlic as divine protector and garlic as dangerous superstition, created a quiet conflict in the minds of the faithful. By the time garlic became forever linked with vampires, it was already burdened with centuries of paradox. In Slavic tales, garlic was the surest weapon. Smear it on windows, hang it in barns, place it in the mouth of the dead to prevent their return. But why garlic? Why not iron, or salt, or silver? The answer may lie in the senses. Salt could be hidden, iron was heavy, but garlic could be smelled. Its very presence was undeniable. A vampire might sneak in silence, but the stink of garlic screamed its resistance. And yet, in some variations of the legend, a person who consumed too much garlic was thought to become more vulnerable, as though the plant's power could invert, attracting what it was meant to repel. Such contradictions show how fear is never straightforward. For the common villager, garlic was medicine. A poultice of crushed cloves was pressed to wounds. Garlic broth was given to those with coughs. During outbreaks of plague, doctors wore beak-shaped masks stuffed with garlic and herbs to filter the bad air. But again, there was suspicion. If someone recovered unusually quickly thanks to garlic, neighbors whispered, was it healing or witchcraft? Was garlic's power truly God's gift, or something more dangerous? This suspicion often fell hardest on women. A village healer who used garlic effectively might be praised one day, accused the next. Garlic could save a child from fever, but it could also condemn a healer to trial. Across Asia, garlic was hung above stables to protect horses from evil spirits. In Korea, legend tells of a bear and a tiger who were transformed into humans after surviving on nothing but garlic and mugwort for 100 days. Garlic here symbolized transformation, a passage from one form of existence to another. In the Middle East, garlic was used to mark thresholds, protecting homes from jinn. But too much reliance on garlic was frowned upon. True faith, religious leaders said, should rest in prayer, not plants. Again and again, we see the same thread. Garlic was always useful, always powerful, but never fully trusted. Imagine a medieval village at dusk. You walk home after a long day in the fields. As you pass doorways, you see garlic braids hanging like pale lanterns. You smell it on your neighbor's breath, in the soup steaming from a pot, in the faint traces rubbed onto the lintel of a barn. Garlic is everywhere, visible, constant, unescapable. And yet, behind this ordinary sight lies unease. People mutter warnings: do not eat too much, do not refuse it altogether, do not forget to hang it on nights when spirits are strongest. Garlic is both necessity and burden, comfort and fear. The story of garlic is not simple. It is a story of human contradiction, the desire to control what cannot be seen, the urge to believe in both science and superstition at once. Garlic was the medicine that worked and the spell that scared, the kitchen staple that shaped faith itself. But this raises a final question. If garlic was so powerful, why did it sometimes fail? Why, despite its braids and blessings, did sickness still sweep through villages and shadows still haunt the night? We've seen garlic as a shield against spirits, a paradox of cure and curse, a pungent thread running through superstition and medicine alike. But no belief lasts untouched. Just as shadows fade with sunrise, garlic's role as a mystical protector dimmed in the light of new ideas. Still, its smell lingers in our kitchens, and with it, the faint trace of its older, stranger power. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe began shifting into an age of reason. Science pushed against superstition. Diseases were studied in anatomy theaters instead of blamed on demons. The plague mask filled with garlic and herbs became a relic, remembered more for its haunting shape than its healing power. Church leaders, too, grew impatient with garlic's stubborn grip on the people. Priests urged villagers to trust in scripture rather than braids of garlic above their doors. And yet, old habits die hard. Even as cities grew and street lamps lit the dark, rural families still whispered that garlic could keep away what prayers sometimes could not. Though garlic's supernatural role declined, it never vanished. In Eastern Europe, garlic rituals continued well into the 19th century. Villages in Romania and Bulgaria still rubbed garlic on cattle horns to protect livestock from disease. Parents pressed garlic into a child's hand on certain nights of the year, just in case. In the Balkans, the garlic and vampire connection persisted. While scholars in universities scoffed, villagers still buried garlic with their dead. Archaeological digs in recent decades have uncovered graves where garlic bulbs rested near the skulls of the deceased, silent testimony to fears that reason could not erase. As garlic's spiritual reputation waned, its medicinal reality emerged. In the 19th century, scientists isolated compounds in garlic that genuinely fight bacteria. By the 20th century, garlic was studied as an antimicrobial, a heart-strengthening agent, even a protector against parasites. In some sense, science circled back to confirm what superstition once sensed. Garlic did ward off invisible enemies, not spirits or witches, but germs. The difference was not garlic's power, but our understanding of what threatened us. Even today, garlic carries echoes of its mythic past. We joke about garlic breath, but hidden in that humor is the old idea that garlic smell makes its presence impossible to ignore. A clove of garlic in a recipe is more than flavor, it is memory, carrying with it centuries of fear and faith. Think of how garlic is still woven into folklore. Children's books about vampires still warn that garlic keeps them away. Horror films use garlic as shorthand for ancient superstition. We laugh, but somewhere deep inside, the old fear remains. Imagine a grandmother in a rural village, tying a braid of garlic to hang above her kitchen. She no longer fears witches. She no longer thinks of spirits pressing at the door. But she remembers her own grandmother, who hung garlic with trembling hands, whispering prayers against the dark. The ritual survives, even when the belief fades. Garlic becomes tradition, habit layered with history, meaning heavier than its weight. Today, garlic is celebrated as superfood. Doctors recommend it for blood pressure and cholesterol. Herbalists hail its natural properties. And yet, advertising sometimes leans on the old myth. Garlic supplements are sold as immune boosters, tapping into the subconscious belief that garlic guards us from unseen forces. We may not call them demons anymore. We call them viruses, bacteria, toxins. The language has changed, but the story feels familiar. What garlic teaches us is not simply about plants, but about people. We fear what we cannot see. We cling to what we can smell, touch, taste. Garlic was never just garlic. It was certainty, wrapped in pungent skin. It was humanity's way of saying, I cannot control the night, but I can hang this above my door and believe that something watches with me. And maybe that belief was as important as the plant itself. From sacred temples of Egypt to vampire-haunted villages of Eastern Europe, garlic's journey shows how deeply humans seek protection. Its role shifted from mystical shield to medical cure, from superstition to science. And still, in kitchens around the world, garlic sizzles in pans and hangs in braids, carrying whispers of its ancient power. So next time you crush a clove, breathe in its sharp scent, and wonder, did people truly believe garlic could fight evil, Or did garlic simply give them courage to face the dark? Picture yourself in a medieval cottage. The fire has burned low, the air carries the cold of the night, and outside the fields rest under a pale moon. You lie on a straw-stuffed mattress, wrapped in coarse wool. You fall asleep easily, lulled by exhaustion. But sometime after midnight, you wake. You do not panic. You do not wonder why. Instead, you sit up, stir the embers back to life, perhaps say a prayer, or step outside to relieve yourself in the cold. You may even visit a neighbor, whisper with your spouse, or tend to small tasks. After an hour or two, you lie back down and slip into your second sleep. This was not strange. This was normal. Modern people often think sleep has always been one long stretch. But evidence shows that for centuries, perhaps millennia, humans practiced segmented sleep. Two distinct blocks divided by a waking period. Historians have uncovered references to first sleep and second sleep in literature, diaries, and legal records across Europe and beyond. The first sleep began shortly after dusk, lasting until midnight or so. Then came the waking hour, sometimes called the watch. After this, people returned to bed for their second sleep, rising at dawn. It was so ordinary that no one explained it. Writers of the time spoke casually of it, the way we mention brushing teeth today. That waking period was not idle. It was used for things that required silence, privacy, or thought. Some prayed. Religious manuals even suggested prayers specifically meant for the midnight hour. Farmers might check on animals or stir the fire. Husbands and wives might talk or share intimacy. In some records, neighbors even visited one another. For poorer households, this was often the only quiet time away from the demands of daylight labor. Tasks too minor for daylight, mending clothes, sharpening tools, could be done by firelight during the watch. Imagine the hush of that hour. Outside, the world was silent, except for the wind or the occasional bark of a dog. Inside, the glow of embers lit a circle of warmth. These were the in-between hours, neither fully night nor day, neither fully asleep nor awake. References to segmented sleep appear everywhere once you know to look. The historian Roger Kirch, who studied the subject deeply, found mentions in texts from the 15th through 19th centuries. For example, in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer mentions characters rising from their first sleep. In 17th century France, a doctor advised patients to rise after their first sleep for quiet reflection, calling it healthier than tossing and turning. Court records from Britain include testimony where witnesses refer to events happening after the first sleep, as though the phrase needed no explanation. It was simply how nights unfolded. Why did people sleep this way? The answer may lie in the natural rhythm of darkness. Before artificial light, people rose and slept with the sun. In winter especially, nights were long, too long to sleep straight through without interruption. The body naturally divided the time. Even today, studies of people living without artificial light show similar patterns. They sleep for 4 hours, wake for 1 or 2, then sleep again until dawn. Our bodies may still carry this rhythm, buried beneath the habits of the modern clock. This waking period was not lonely. In villages, lights flickered in many windows at the same hour. The midnight watch became a kind of quiet, hidden society, neighbors meeting in hushed tones, lovers slipping out, mothers nursing children. One French priest complained that midnight was when more sin was committed than at any other hour. Yet another priest praised it as the most blessed time, when prayers were strongest. The same hour could be a space of temptation or devotion. Imagine yourself in 1500s England. You sleep soon after dusk. Around midnight, your eyes open. You add wood to the fire, the crackle waking the dog at your feet. You sit with your spouse, whisper about the harvest, perhaps share bread left over from supper. Outside, a neighbor's candle glows faintly, another family awake in the watch. After an hour, your eyelids grow heavy again. You lie down, slip into second sleep, and wake at dawn with the rooster's crow. This rhythm was life itself, unnoticed until it vanished. We often imagine history as alien, but the truth is stranger. The past lived by rhythms we have forgotten, rhythms that may still lie in our bones. But why did we stop? Why did the practice of 2 sleeps, so natural and widespread, disappear almost entirely from memory? The idea of 2 sleeps feels almost unthinkable today. We imagine a normal night as one continuous block, and anything else as insomnia. Yet for centuries, the segmented night was life's quiet truth. So how did it vanish? The answer lies in a chain of small changes: wax candles, city lights, the printing press, coffee houses, and finally the industrial clock. Each one stretched the night thinner, until the second sleep was lost. In medieval times, light was precious. A single candle could cost a day's wage for the poor. Families rationed them carefully, often saving them for church or special events. Darkness, therefore, forced early bedtimes and segmented nights. But as candlemaking improved and prices dropped, wealthier households could afford to stay awake longer. Night became flexible, negotiable. People read, talked, and worked later. The rhythm of the first sleep shifted later, shortening the gap before the second. Eventually, the watch disappeared entirely. It began with the wealthy, nobles and merchants, but slowly trickled down as lighting grew cheaper. Light stretched the hours, squeezing out the in-between. Books were another enemy of segmented sleep. By the 16th century, reading was becoming a private habit. But reading requires light. Candlelit nights became more common, and the hours once reserved for the watch became hours of study. A scholar in Paris might sit hunched over his Bible until dawn, burning through both candle and body. Diaries from the time describe reading as the new midnight companion, displacing prayers and neighborly visits. The quiet hour between sleeps became too valuable to waste in silence. The biggest shift came with public lighting. In 1667, Paris installed the first major network of street lamps. Soon after, London followed, and European cities began glowing through the night. Darkness was no longer total. People felt safer walking at midnight, and taverns, theaters, and coffee houses flourished. Once night became social, the two-sleep system faltered. Instead of sleeping early, people stayed awake later into the night, collapsing into a single block of rest. What was once a natural rhythm was replaced by an urban one, driven by commerce and entertainment. The true death of the second sleep came with the Industrial Revolution. Factories demanded strict schedules. Workers could no longer afford midnight waking. They had to rise at dawn, alert and ready for labor. Employers prized punctuality, and long, uninterrupted sleep was suddenly a virtue. Clocks regulated life in a way nature never did. Train timetables, factory bells, school schedules, all demanded synchronization. Two sleeps became impractical, even shameful. By the 19th century, first sleep and second sleep were fading from language, replaced by the expectation of one solid night. There was another quiet revolution: caffeine. Coffee houses opened in Europe in the 17th century, selling bitter, black energy in a cup. Tea spread through Britain by the 18th century. Both helped people stretch their waking hours. Where once the midnight watch was a calm, reflective hour, it became a time fueled by stimulants. Writers, merchants, and revolutionaries met in smoky coffee houses at hours that once belonged to silence. The old rhythm fractured, a new one, jittery and buzzing, took hold. As science advanced, segmented sleep was reclassified. Doctors of the 18th and 19th centuries began writing of continuous sleep as the healthier option. By the 20th century, waking at night was labeled insomnia, a problem to be fixed, not a rhythm to accept. What had been ordinary for thousands of years became pathologized. People forgot the second sleep not because it vanished naturally, but because it was redefined as abnormal. Imagine standing in a cobbled street in 1700. Oil lamps cast their glow down narrow lanes. Taverns spill laughter, coffee houses hum with debate. You look up at the windows above, and fewer candles burn at midnight than they once did. The watch is shrinking, the silence fading. By 1850, in many cities, the second sleep is gone entirely. People collapse late, wake early for work, and never speak of the old pattern again. The second sleep did not vanish all at once. It eroded, chipped away by light, books, coffee, and clocks. What was once natural became strange, then forgotten. But this raises a haunting question. If the two-sleep rhythm was once so natural, does it still live in us? Do our restless nights, our 3 a.m. wakings, whisper of an older rhythm our ancestors knew by heart? For centuries, the first and second sleep shaped human nights. Then came clocks, candles, and caffeine, burying the rhythm until it was forgotten. But the body remembers what the mind forgets. In recent decades, scientists have stumbled upon strange patterns that sound suspiciously familiar. And with them comes a realization: the second sleep may not be gone at all. It may simply be waiting in the dark. The historian Roger Kirch, studying diaries, court records, and old literature, pieced together the puzzle in the late 20th century. He found hundreds of casual references to first sleep and second sleep. These weren't poetic phrases. They were instructions, confessions, medical advice, testimonies. They were everyday life. Kirch's research shook the field of sleep science. Suddenly, the fragmented nights of medieval peasants made sense. Waking in the middle of the night wasn't insomnia, it was human nature. In the 1990s, a study placed volunteers in conditions without artificial light. Deprived of electricity, their bodies shifted. They began to fall asleep shortly after dusk, woke around midnight for an hour or two, and then drifted into a second sleep. Their patterns mirrored medieval nights almost exactly. The body, left alone, returned to its forgotten rhythm. How many of us have jolted awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering what's wrong? Doctors call it insomnia. But what if it is memory? That wakeful window may not be a flaw but a ghost of the watch, the hour our ancestors used for prayer, reflection, or quiet tasks. In truth, the frustration we feel at midnight wakefulness may come not from the body, but from culture's demand for 8 solid hours. Historians suggest the midnight watch was more than an inconvenience, it was productive. People reported their most vivid dreams between first and second sleep. Letters from the period describe clarity of thought, bursts of creativity, even spiritual visions. The stillness of the night created space for meditation. In monasteries, monks rose intentionally at midnight for prayer, believing it the most sacred hour. Perhaps what we call restlessness today was once seen as an invitation to reflection. Picture yourself trying it today. You turn off the lights at dusk, sleep for 4 hours, then wake naturally at midnight. You read, write, or pray by candlelight. The world is silent, no notifications, no clocks demanding action. After an hour, you lie back down, slipping into another deep rest until dawn. The rhythm feels strange at first, but soon you notice. Your sleep feels heavier, your dreams more vivid, your mornings less frantic. You've slipped into an old groove, hidden under centuries of routine. We did not forget because it was worse. We forgot because the world changed. Factories needed workers who rose at the same time. Cities wanted evenings filled with entertainment. Families needed steady schedules. And so, the fluid night was replaced by the solid block. Convenience triumphed over rhythm. But perhaps we lost something in that bargain, an intimacy with the night, a softness to our waking, a secret society of silence. If garlic was once hung to ward off what the night concealed, segmented sleep was how people learned to live with it. Both were survival strategies for darkness. One guarded the body, the other the mind. Together, they show how humans negotiated with fear and nature. The story of the long night watch reminds us that normal is not eternal. What we call insomnia might once have been peace. What we see as a flaw may be memory. Tonight, if you wake at 3 a.m., instead of frustration, imagine your ancestors rising quietly, tending a fire, whispering in the hush of the watch. Imagine that you are not broken, but simply keeping company with history. And ask yourself, if our bodies still remember the second sleep, what other forgotten rhythms lie waiting beneath the surface of modern life? Imagine standing in a medieval village at dusk. The sun has slipped below the horizon, and instantly the world is swallowed by darkness. There are no street lamps, no glow of windows, no hum of electricity. Only the faint silver of the moon, and the shadows of trees stretching like fingers across the ground. Inside your home, the hearth burns low. If you want light, real, steady light, you need a candle. But for many families, that small flicker came at a staggering price, a full day's wage. To burn one candle casually was not luxury. It was recklessness. Before artificial light, night was total. Scholars describe it as an ocean of blackness, broken only by stars, fire, and the occasional lantern. For ordinary people, darkness was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Thieves thrived at night. Roads were perilous. Superstition filled the void. Spirits were thought to roam freely after sundown. Darkness shaped behavior. People hurried home before twilight, shutters were closed tight, and villages seemed to hold their breath. The candle was not just a tool. It was survival. In the Middle Ages, candles were made primarily from tallow, rendered animal fat, or beeswax. Tallow candles were cheaper but smoky, foul-smelling, and prone to sputtering. Beeswax candles, by contrast, burned cleanly and brightly, but they were so expensive that only churches and the wealthy could afford them. Records show that in 13th century England, the average laborer might earn a penny a day, and a single beeswax candle could cost the same. To burn one for several hours was to burn away your wages. This economy of light meant families rationed candles carefully. A peasant household might use a candle only for special occasions, while relying on the fire hearth for most illumination. Even wealthier homes were cautious. Light was wealth made visible. The church became one of the greatest consumers of candles. Vast cathedrals glowed with beeswax during services. Their golden light meant to symbolize purity and divinity. The faithful were encouraged to purchase candles as offerings, each flame a prayer embodied in wax. For villagers, donating a candle was both devotion and sacrifice. To light one in a cathedral was to surrender a piece of your labor, your survival, for the sake of the soul. To have a house filled with candles was to declare wealth. Nobles held feasts in great halls blazing with dozens of flames, their guests dazzled not only by food but by light itself. Travelers recorded amazement at banquets where chandeliers burned like suns indoors. Meanwhile, peasants returned home to embers and shadows. For them, the glow of a single candle could feel like a small miracle. Imagine being a peasant mother in the 14th century. You tuck your children into bed just after sunset, long before they are sleepy, because there is no light to spare. You save the single candle stub for mending clothes, keeping it for the deepest of winter nights when firelight alone is not enough. Your husband jokes that the candle is more valuable than the boots on his feet. It is not a joke. The wax in your cupboard represents hours of labor, traded not for bread, but for brightness. Candles carried meanings beyond illumination. To let a candle burn too low was unlucky. It could summon spirits or foreshadow death. A candle blown out suddenly was said to signal the presence of the devil. In some regions, people believed that staring into a candle flame too long allowed you to glimpse visions of the future, or of restless souls. The flame itself seemed alive, fragile, both sacred and dangerous. The candle was not just wax and wick. It was the border between darkness and life, between safety and fear. To strike a match today feels ordinary. To strike a flame then was to call forth wealth, safety, and a fragile defiance of the night. But if candles were so valuable, how did people choose when to burn them? And how did this economy of light shape work, leisure, and even love? To hold a candle in your hand was to hold time itself. Every inch of wax that melted marked money spent, labor lost, and choices made. Candles were not burned thoughtlessly. They were rationed, hoarded, used with strategy. And in their glow, entire worlds of habit, ritual, and imagination were formed. For ordinary households, candles determined what could and could not be done after dusk. Most tasks ended with daylight. But when a candle was lit, its flame bought back precious minutes or hours. Tailors stitched clothes by candlelight. Scribes copied texts in monasteries, their work slow and painstaking, their eyes straining. Farmers might sharpen tools or mend harnesses in the dim glow of a tallow wick. But these were costly hours. A family might decide, do we use the candle tonight to fix the cart, or save it for winter prayers? The flame was never neutral. It always carried weight. Candles also created intimacy. In villages where families crowded into one-room huts, privacy was rare. But in the glow of a single candle, lovers carved out private space. A flame could shield whispers, soften faces, and create an illusion of seclusion. In folklore, many tales described secret trysts by candlelight. But even here, caution lingered. Burning a candle for romance meant sacrificing a piece of household survival. Love was measured in melted wax. Religion gave candles their grandest stage. Monasteries and cathedrals consumed them in staggering numbers. Monks rose at midnight to chant by candlelight. Priests carried candles in processions, flames flickering in the night as symbols of eternal truth. But for the common believer, the candle had a double role. It was both an offering and a cost. To buy a candle to place at the altar might mean less food on the table. And yet, families did it, believing the flame carried their prayers to heaven. Even funerals were marked by candles, each flame standing as a fragile soul light guiding the dead. To die without candles was considered a terrible fate. Among the wealthy, candles became symbols of excess. Nobles held feasts with chandeliers blazing, dozens or even hundreds of candles burning at once. The light itself was a display of power, a declaration that they could afford to burn what others hoarded. Visitors to royal courts often described not the food or music, but the light, a hall lit so brightly by candles that it seemed like daylight indoors. In palaces, wealth was not only counted in coin but in the brilliance of the night. Behind the glow was an entire economy. In many cities, candlemakers formed guilds, tightly controlling production and prices. Apprentices learned to render tallow, dip wicks, and shape uniform sticks of wax. Guild rules were strict. Beeswax was reserved for the church and nobility, while tallow served commoners. This division hardened social boundaries. Even light itself became a class marker. To smell the clean burn of beeswax was to know privilege. To cough on the smoke of tallow was to know poverty. The candle was also a clock. People measured hours by the burning of wax. Some households carved notches into candles so they could track time during the night. A burning candle became not just light, but calendar and watch combined. Superstitions grew around this function. To let a candle burn past a notch was unlucky, as though time itself had slipped. In some regions, fortune-tellers read melted wax, interpreting shapes as omens. The candle became a mediator between human and fate. Imagine a family in midwinter, huddled in a dark cottage. Outside, snow buries the fields. The night stretches long, oppressive. The father takes down the single beeswax candle saved for the season. Its flame fills the room, golden, soft. For a moment, the hut feels alive with warmth. The children whisper in awe. The mother closes her eyes to pray. Every face glows, every heart steadies. Then the flame gutters. Wax melts away, and silence returns with the dark. Candles were not mere tools. They were choices. To light one was to gamble, between work and rest, prayer and hunger, love and survival. Each flicker of flame carried the weight of a world without electricity, where light itself was a form of wealth. But this raises a final question. What happened when new sources of light arrived? When oil lamps, gas lights, and finally electricity made brightness cheap and abundant, how did the candle's meaning change? Did it lose its power, or did its symbolism endure? For centuries, the candle was a symbol of wealth, devotion, and survival. Every flicker was labor melted into light. But history does not stand still. As new sources of illumination spread, whale oil, gas, and finally electricity, the candle lost its place as necessity. Yet it did not vanish. It became something else, a relic, a ritual, a memory of a world defined by darkness. By the 18th century, whale oil lamps began to replace tallow candles in many households. They burned longer, brighter, and often cheaper. Cities introduced gas lamps in the 19th century, turning night into day in streets once cloaked in black. For the first time, light was no longer scarce. A household could extend its waking hours without calculating the cost of every flicker. Candles, once central, began to fade into the background. Then came the electric bulb, the true death knell for candlelight as necessity. In 1879, Thomas Edison's invention made light cheap, safe, and nearly infinite. The world's rhythms shifted again. Factories ran late into the night, cities glowed ceaselessly, and midnight lost its silence. Where a candle had once marked wealth, its role was reduced to memory. No longer a tool of survival, it became a symbol of something older, slower, more fragile. Yet the candle refused to disappear. In churches, candles still burned as offerings, their flames carrying prayers heavenward. The faithful continued to believe that a flame spoke more clearly than words. At funerals, candles still guided the dead. On birthdays, they still marked wishes. In these rituals, the candle transcended utility. It was no longer about light in the dark, but meaning in the moment. As electricity filled the night, candles gained a new role, not survival, but atmosphere. Lovers dined by candlelight not because they lacked lamps, but because the flame softened the world. A candle's glow blurred edges, hushed voices, and made ordinary rooms feel private. What once signaled wealth now signaled affection. A single candle on a table became shorthand for intimacy, a memory of when light itself was rare. Candles also became memorials of hardship. During power outages, people instinctively reach for candles. The act connects us to ancestors who lived their whole lives by flickering flame. When the lights go out, we remember how fragile our bright world is. This memory is why candles hold their place. They remind us that abundance is new, and that scarcity once shaped every night. Imagine a Victorian family in the late 19th century. The father switches on a gas lamp in the parlor. Bright, steady, efficient. But on the mantel, a pair of beeswax candles still stand, unlit. They are not needed, but they remain, symbols of tradition. On Sundays, one is lit for prayer. On a birthday, both are lit for joy. The candle has lost its daily authority but kept its dignity. Today, candles are everywhere, yet nowhere. They line supermarket shelves, sold not as necessities but as luxuries. Scented, colored, designed for mood. We do not think of their cost in wages. We think of their cost in comfort. They burn at vigils, at weddings, at dinners. They symbolize memory, faith, romance. Their old power to chase away the dark has been replaced by a quieter one, to remind us of what darkness felt like. The story of the candle is the story of human longing, for safety, for beauty, for connection. Once worth a day's wage, once burned with trembling hands, candles are now lit casually, and yet their meaning lingers. So next time you light one, notice how the flame pulls your eyes, how it hushes the room, how it carries a weight far older than you. And ask yourself, is the candle's glow truly weaker than electricity, or does it still hold a power we cannot measure in watts? You wake in the middle of the night in a medieval home. The fire has burned low, the wind rattles the shutters, and outside the village lies buried in silence. You need relief, but stepping outside into the cold, into darkness, is dangerous. Wolves prowl, thieves wander, and spirits are said to roam freely after midnight. So you reach for the humble tool that saved generations from cold trips and dangerous walks, the chamber pot. Plain, sturdy, often made of clay or metal, it was one of the most important objects in a household. Everyone had one. Few spoke of it, but it was central to daily life. For most of history, organized sewage systems were rare luxuries. Ancient Rome had aqueducts and public latrines, but after its collapse, Europe lost much of that infrastructure. By the Middle Ages, people relied on simple solutions: privies dug into the ground, cesspits near homes, or rivers that carried waste away. But at night, in winter, or for the sick and elderly, walking to a privy was impractical. The chamber pot brought the privy indoors. It turned necessity into something manageable, though not always pleasant. The chamber pot was universal, but its form revealed status. A poor family might use a plain clay bowl, rough and unglazed. Wealthier households owned brass or pewter pots, polished to a shine. Aristocrats flaunted porcelain imports from China, painted with delicate designs, proof that even the most private act could be dressed in wealth. For royalty, chamber pots became elaborate. Some were padded with velvet or built into ornate chairs known as commodes. King Louis XIV reportedly held audiences while seated on his, a reminder that even kings shared this most basic human need. Each morning began with the emptying of chamber pots. Servants carried them to cesspits or simply tossed their contents into the street. In cities like Paris or London, cries of "Garde-l'eau," from the French "Gardez l'eau," "Watch out for the water," warned pedestrians below that waste was about to rain down. The stench was inescapable. Travelers wrote of city streets reeking of waste. Shoes were ruined daily. Epidemics thrived in these conditions. But this was ordinary life, as natural to medieval citizens as traffic is to us today. Though necessary, chamber pots carried layers of shame and humor. They were hidden under beds or behind curtains. Guests sometimes mocked one another if pots were poorly disguised. Writers joked about chamber pots in plays and poems, proof that even then, people laughed at the awkwardness of bodily needs. At the same time, chamber pots gave a strange sense of privacy. Instead of trudging outside, you could remain in the warmth of your room, shielded from the gaze of others. It was crude comfort, but comfort nonetheless. On long journeys, Travelers carried pots in wagons or ships. Soldiers in fortresses relied on them when battle made leaving impossible. In castles under siege, chamber pots became survival tools, small, grim weapons against discomfort. During war, some chamber pots were even weaponized. Tales tell of defenders emptying pots on attackers scaling castle walls. Waste was more than filth, it was defense. Imagine a noblewoman's chamber in the 1500s. Tapestries cover the walls, candles glow in iron holders, a feather bed dominates the room. Beside it, half hidden, rests a porcelain chamber pot, painted with blue dragons. In the morning, her maid will carry it discreetly away. Across town, in a peasant hut, a clay pot waits under the bed. It has no decoration, no beauty, only purpose. But both serve the same end. Kings and beggars alike bend to the same necessity. The chamber pot was not glamorous, but it was essential. It shaped routines, reflected class, and revealed the hidden labor of those who emptied it. It was, in its way, a symbol of survival. But what happened when cities grew larger, when sanitation became a crisis, when disease spread through filth-filled streets? How did the chamber pot's humble role collide with the rise of public health and modern sanitation? The chamber pot served households well enough when villages were small and life was spread thin across open fields. But as towns grew into cities, the quiet morning act of emptying pots multiplied into a crisis. One pot's contents were manageable. Thousands became a flood. And with them came stink, sickness, and the first rumblings of reform. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe's cities had swelled. London, Paris, and Amsterdam teemed with people, each home relying on chamber pots. Servants, apprentices, and housewives carried them to cesspits or dumped them into the street. The cries of "Gardaloo" rang daily, but not everyone warned. Waste pooled in alleys, seeped into rivers, and spread through markets. Travelers recorded their disgust. A Venetian visiting Paris in the 1600s wrote of streets, soaked with filth, unbearable to the nose. Shoes and hems were ruined daily. For the poor, who lived closest to the waste, illness became constant companion. Chamber pots were practical, but they carried invisible dangers. Without sewers, waste contaminated wells and rivers. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread swiftly. Epidemics became a grim rhythm of city life. Doctors struggled to understand. The theory of miasma, bad air, dominated thinking. People believed the stench itself caused disease. In truth, it was bacteria, unseen and unknown. Still, the smell of overflowing pots was enough to convince reformers that something had to change. The chamber pot was also a symbol of labor's divide. In wealthy homes, servants shouldered the burden of carrying, scrubbing, and disposing. They rose before dawn, moving silently through grand houses with pots of brass and porcelain, performing a task no one wished to mention. Writers joked that the lowest servant was master of the night soil. For them, the chamber pot was not convenience, it was drudgery. Sanitation reform, when it came, was as much about dignity as disease. As cities grew crowded, chamber pots followed people beyond the bedroom. Inns supplied them in rented rooms. Travelers carried portable pots in coaches. Even theaters kept them nearby. In Versailles, courtiers often relieved themselves in corners of the palace, pots not always provided in sufficient number. Despite the grandeur, the stink of waste clung to the halls. Cleanliness was a privilege yet to be invented. Urban authorities tried solutions. Cesspits were dug deeper, emptied by night soilmen who carted waste beyond city walls. Some cities regulated when waste could be tossed from windows. Others built public latrines, but they were poorly maintained and rarely trusted. The chamber pot remained stubbornly central. It was too convenient to abandon, too necessary to replace. Reform would require not only technology but imagination. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers began to link cleanliness with civilization. Writers argued that filth reflected moral decay. Reformers pushed for better waste disposal, cleaner streets, and eventually underground sewers. In London, Sir Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population exposed the connection between waste and disease. His work, though resisted, marked the beginning of modern public health. The chamber pot, once invisible in daily life, had become the subject of political debate. Picture London in 1750. At dawn, streets awaken with clatter. Servants pour chamber pots into gutters, their contents flowing downhill. A child plays nearby, splashing without awareness. A tradesman curses as his boots sink into foul puddles. The air grows thick as the sun warms the waste. This was not unusual. It was routine. And yet, reformers whispered, surely this cannot last. The chamber pot carried humanity through centuries, but in cities, its limits became undeniable. What once offered comfort now spread disease. Its humble utility collided with the scale of urban growth, and change became inevitable. But what happened when the chamber pot began to fade? How did the arrival of indoor plumbing, flushing toilets, and sewage systems transform not only sanitation but the very rhythms of daily life? For centuries, the chamber pot was a quiet servant of survival, crude but dependable. It carried us through winters, plagues, and long nights. But history is restless. Inventions came that made the pot seem outdated, even laughable. And yet, like many forgotten tools, it never truly vanished. The revolution began in the 18th and 19th centuries with experiments in water closets, early versions of the modern toilet. Some were elaborate contraptions with levers and valves, others simple boxes with flushing systems. Wealthy households were the first to adopt them, piping waste directly into sewers. Still, resistance lingered. Many mistrusted running water inside the home. Some feared pipes would leak or spread disease. Others clung to the chamber pot out of habit. But as sewers expanded in cities, and as reformers pushed for hygiene, plumbing slowly spread. By the late 19th century, middle-class homes in Europe and America were boasting of indoor conveniences. The chamber pot's days as daily necessity were numbered. As toilets became common, chamber pots shifted roles. In wealthy homes, they became backups, tucked away for emergencies. In rural villages, they lingered longer, especially where plumbing reached slowly. By the early 20th century, chamber pots were fading into memory. What had once been a household staple was now a mark of poverty or backwardness. Children in cities laughed at stories of grandparents emptying pots at dawn. With its decline came ridicule. Plays, cartoons, and jokes turned the chamber pot into a comic symbol. In France, it earned the nickname Le Vase de Nuit, the night vase. In Britain, it became a running gag in music halls. Even porcelain manufacturers joined in, producing chamber pots painted with witty phrases at the bottom. Jokes revealed only when the pot was emptied. One common design showed a politician's face inside the bowl, inviting the user to make their opinion known. The object that once carried quiet dignity became a punchline. Yet not all uses vanished. Chamber pots lingered for children, the sick, and the elderly. Known as commodes in hospitals, they remained vital tools for those who could not easily rise to reach a toilet. For many families, especially in rural areas, a chamber pot under the bed remained practical well into the mid-20th century. Electricity and plumbing were not universal, and necessity outlives pride. In some cultures, the chamber pot even became part of tradition. In parts of France, a humorous wedding custom called le pot de chambre survives, where newlyweds are served a symbolic drink from a chamber pot, usually chocolate or champagne. The ritual is comic, but it reflects the pot's deep entanglement with daily life. In museums today, chamber pots are displayed with care, often surprising visitors with their decoration and variety. Some are plain clay, others painted with flowers or lined with silver. They remind us that no object is too humble to carry beauty. Imagine a home in 1890. A new water closet has just been installed upstairs. The family is proud, showing it off to neighbors. Yet under the bed in the servants' room, a chamber pot still waits. Old habits die hard. The pot will remain there for years, used quietly, even as plumbing takes over. The transition was never sudden. It was layered, uneven, human. Today, the chamber pot survives mostly in memory. Grandparents tell stories of carrying pots to empty in cold mornings. Folklore preserves jokes, proverbs, and superstitions about them. Children giggle at the thought of kings and queens using pots as humble as their own. They remind us that history is not just battles and inventions, but the daily, awkward acts that bind us all. The chamber pot rose from necessity, carried humanity through centuries of darkness and disease, and fell with the triumph of plumbing. Yet in its fall, It left behind something valuable: humility. No matter how grand the hall, no matter how gilded the throne, every life was tethered to the same simple need. And perhaps that is the chamberpot's quiet lesson, that history is not only about crowns and conquests, but about pots beneath beds, emptied at dawn, forgotten but never unimportant. So next time you flush a toilet, consider: is it merely convenience, or is it the latest chapter in humanity's endless struggle with one of its oldest, most ordinary problems? Imagine a medieval village in winter. Fields lie bare, stores of grain dwindle, and bread is the core of survival. Each family guards its sacks of rye and wheat like treasure. But hidden within that bread is a silent killer, a black fungus clinging to the rye kernels. The bread looks ordinary, the crust warm, the smell familiar. Yet once eaten, it can bring madness, convulsions, even death. The villagers do not understand fungi, spores, or toxins. They see only strange sickness sweeping households, limbs twisting, visions tormenting minds. They call it St. Anthony's fire. The culprit was ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains in damp conditions. It forms dark, hardened structures called sclerotia, which mix with normal kernels during harvest. When ground into flour, ergot blends invisibly into bread. Inside ergot are powerful alkaloids, chemical cousins of LSD and certain poisons. These compounds constrict blood vessels, cause gangrene, trigger hallucinations, and lead to violent convulsions. In small doses, ergot can mimic divine visions. In large doses, it destroys bodies. For centuries, no one knew what it was. To villagers, it seemed like punishment, curse, or plague. Ergot poisoning struck in two terrifying forms: convulsive ergotism. Victims experienced seizures, spasms, crawling sensations on the skin, and terrifying hallucinations. They screamed of demons, angels, or animals tearing at them. Some danced uncontrollably, unable to stop. Gangrenous ergotism. Blood flow to extremities was cut off. Fingers, toes, and even limbs blackened and fell away. The pain was unbearable, and the stench of rotting flesh filled villages. The condition was unpredictable. Whole families might be struck while neighbors escaped. Priests and doctors had no explanation beyond God's anger or devil's work. Picture a winter evening in a French village, 10th century. Families gather to eat the only food they have: coarse rye bread. Within hours, screams echo through the streets. A child convulses, a mother claws at her own skin, a farmer collapses with burning pain in his legs. The priest declares it a curse. The villagers flock to the church, desperate for protection. They pray to St. Anthony, patron of the afflicted. But the bread, their lifeline, has become their executioner. The disease became so common in medieval Europe that it earned a saint's name: St. Anthony's fire. Monastic orders, especially the Order of St. Anthony, cared for victims. They built hospitals, applying soothing balms, offering prayer, and giving patients clean wheat bread instead of rye. To many, the monks seemed miracle workers. In truth, they had stumbled on the cure: bread free of ergot. Without understanding fungi, they saved lives simply by changing diets. Ergot symptoms blurred the line between illness and possession. Convulsions and hallucinations looked like witchcraft to frightened villagers. Some historians believe outbreaks of ergotism fed the witch trials of Europe. When young women writhed, screamed, or saw visions, neighbors whispered of sorcery, when in fact, it may have been poisoned bread. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692, in colonial Massachusetts, have been linked by some scholars to ergot-contaminated rye. Though debated, the theory shows how blurred the line was between medicine and superstition. Ergot struck hardest among the poor. Wealthy families ate wheat, less prone to infection. The poor relied on rye, which thrived in damp fields but was far more vulnerable to the fungus. Hunger left no choice. When food was scarce, contaminated grain was eaten anyway. This cruel divide turned ergotism into a disease of class. The poor burned with St. Anthony's fire while the rich dined safely. Bread is supposed to sustain, to nourish, to comfort. Yet for centuries, in forgotten villages, it carried death and madness. Every loaf was a gamble, every meal a risk. But how did people respond? How did fear of poisoned bread shape faith, medicine, and culture? And how did the slow uncovering of ergot secrets change history itself? The villagers knew bread sustained them. But when bread turned cruel, They sought explanations beyond the field and mill. The sickness that clawed at their limbs and twisted their minds was too strange, too sudden. So they turned to the language they knew best: curses, demons, divine punishment. Ergot was invisible to their eyes. But its effects, the burning, the visions, the writhing bodies, were all too visible. And from that gap between ignorance and terror grew stories, rituals, and persecutions that shaped culture for centuries. The Order of St. Anthony, founded in the 11th century, became the most famous caretakers of ergot victims. Their hospitals, often near fields of rye, filled with the afflicted. Patients screamed of burning skin, clawed at their limbs, or drifted into trances. The monks shaved their heads in a distinctive T shape and dressed in black robes with a blue cross. They offered balm made from herbs and pig fat, wine-soaked bandages, and most importantly, wheat bread. Those who recovered credited the saint, not the diet. Pilgrimages to churches dedicated to St. Anthony spread across Europe. His relics were said to cure the fire. The disease strengthened the bond between suffering and faith. Convulsive ergotism blurred the line between illness and prophecy. Victims reported visions of angels, devils, and radiant colors. Some danced uncontrollably, others sang in ecstasy. In an age when visions were seen as divine signs, these episodes carried enormous weight. Mystics who experienced such symptoms were sometimes revered. Their hallucinations were written into hagiographies, celebrated as encounters with God. Others, especially women, were feared as witches. The same symptoms could mark sainthood or sorcery, depending on who was watching. When young women convulsed or claimed to see demons, suspicion fell swiftly. Villages already primed by fear of witchcraft saw the symptoms of ergotism as evidence of spells. Fingers pointed, trials began. Historians debate how directly ergot fed the witch hunts, but the parallels are haunting. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, teenage girls accused neighbors of bewitching them, their bodies writhing, their speech fragmented. Some scholars suggest ergot-infected rye, stored in damp New England barns, may have sparked the hysteria. Even if ergot was not the sole cause, its symptoms matched too closely to be ignored: visions, convulsions, and burning pains that seemed to come from nowhere. Imagine being a mother in 15th century France. Your children eat rye bread, the only food you have. Days later, your youngest begins to twitch and scream at night, claiming to see beasts in the dark. Neighbors whisper, "Perhaps your family is cursed. Perhaps you, the mother, are to blame." You pray at St. Anthony's shrine, offering what little you have for a candle. You clutch your child as monks feed him wheat bread. If he survives, it is a miracle. If he dies, your grief is tinged with shame. This was the cruel burden of ergot, not only pain, but suspicion. Though most explanations were religious or magical, some physicians noticed patterns. They saw outbreaks followed damp harvests, poor storage, and poverty. A few suspected rye itself. In 1676, a physician named Thuillier in France described the connection clearly. Ergot-infected rye caused the illness. Still, recognition spread slowly. For many, the connection between fungus and disease was too abstract. The poor had no choice but to eat contaminated bread anyway. Knowledge alone could not fill empty stomachs. Outbreaks often coincided with famine, when people were forced to eat spoiled grain. Armies on campaign were especially vulnerable. Chronicles describe soldiers struck with sudden convulsions, unable to march. In 944, an epidemic in France reportedly killed 40,000 people. Villages emptied, fields lay untended, and survivors carried scars, missing limbs lost to gangrene, or memories of visions that haunted them. The tragedy was sharpened by irony. Bread was sacred. In Christianity, bread was the body of Christ, the center of ritual. To see bread destroy instead of nourish shook faith itself. Some priests declared it a test. Others saw it as proof of sin. Bread had always been more than food. It was survival, symbol, community. Ergot turned that symbol inside out, transforming the holiest sustenance into the most terrifying poison. Ergot was not just a disease of the body. It was a disease of culture, twisting faith, fueling witch hunts, reshaping the meaning of bread itself. It haunted villages not only with death but with doubt. If even bread could betray you, what in life was safe? But over time, observation grew sharper. Farmers and physicians learned to recognize ergot, to discard infected grain, to breed safer crops. Outbreaks declined. And yet, ergot did not vanish. It lingered in medicine, in chemistry, and even in the birth of modern drugs. By the late Middle Ages, the terror of ergot had become part of Europe's memory. Villagers spoke of St. Anthony's fire as past generations had spoken of famine or plague. But like many old enemies, ergot did not vanish overnight. It retreated, waiting in fields, reappearing when harvests were damp and hunger was sharp. Its story continued, reshaping itself with science, medicine, and even philosophy. Several changes helped ergot's grip loosen. Farming practices improved. Farmers learned to better separate infected kernels during harvest. Wheat replaced rye in many wealthier regions, reducing exposure. By the 18th century, outbreaks were less frequent, though still deadly in poor, damp areas of Eastern Europe and Russia. Public health reforms also played a role. As towns demanded cleaner food supplies, infected rye was increasingly discarded. Over time, ergot shifted from being a widespread curse to an occasional disaster. Ironically, the very compounds that killed peasants became tools for healing. Physicians discovered ergot could stop bleeding after childbirth by contracting the uterus. Midwives used it to prevent hemorrhage, though often dangerously, as overdoses caused convulsions. By the 19th century, chemists isolated ergot alkaloids, ergotamine, ergotoxine, and others. These were refined into medicines to treat migraines and circulatory problems. Doctors prescribed ergot derivatives cautiously, knowing the thin line between remedy and poison. What once brought terror to villages now saved lives in hospitals. The fungus had not changed. Only human knowledge had. In the 20th century, ergot revealed an even stranger secret. In 1938, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, from ergot alkaloids. At first, it seemed unremarkable. But in 1943, Hofmann accidentally absorbed a small dose and entered a hallucinatory state unlike any known. The same fungus that once tormented peasants with visions now became the foundation of modern psychedelic research. From monasteries treating St. Anthony's fire to laboratories experimenting with LSD, ergot's link to altered states spanned centuries. Picture two scenes, centuries apart. A village in 1100. A child convulses after eating rye bread. A mother weeps, clutching him in a smoky hut. Priests declare it a curse. A laboratory in 1943. A chemist cycles home through Swiss streets, the world shimmering with colors and shapes. He has no idea he has just sparked a revolution in science and culture. The same fungus binds them, from agony to experiment, from curse to curiosity. The hallucinations of ergotism may have inspired more than fear. Some historians suggest outbreaks influenced medieval art, with its grotesque figures and visions of hell. Others see echoes of ergot in ecstatic religious movements, where burning sensations and visions of fire shaped spiritual experience. Ergot was not just biology. It was imagination, reshaping how people saw themselves and their world. Ergot still exists. Farmers monitor rye crops carefully, discarding infected kernels. In modern medicine, ergot derivatives remain in use, though overshadowed by safer drugs. Outbreaks like those of the Middle Ages are gone, but the memory lingers in museums, in medical texts, and in the folklore of villages once haunted by St. Anthony's fire. The story of ergot is the story of paradox. It was both food and poison, curse and cure, destroyer and savior. It blurred the line between faith and science, between visions divine and hallucinations chemical. Bread, the symbol of life, once carried death within it. But from that death came knowledge, medicine, and even new ways of understanding the mind. So next time you break bread, remember, this most ordinary of foods once hid a fungus that shaped faith, fueled fear, and even changed the future of science. And ask yourself, if bread could carry such power, what other ordinary parts of life hold forgotten dangers, or hidden miracles? It is dawn in a world without clocks. The rooster crows, mist curls above the fields, and light spills slowly across the horizon. You rise, not because of numbers glowing on a device, but because the sun itself has called you. For most of human history, there were no mechanical clocks. Hours, as we know them, were meaningless. People measured time in shadows, in meals, in church bells, in the rhythm of tasks. Time was not numbers ticking, it was lived experience. And before the machine age, knowing time meant watching the world with patient eyes. The earliest timekeepers were not inventions but elements. The cycle of day and night, the phases of the moon, the changing of seasons, these were the first calendars. Hunters knew when to follow herds by the stars. Farmers sowed and harvested by the sun's position. Sailors steered by constellations. Life was not carved into minutes but stretched into cycles. Noon was when the sun stood high. Evening was when shadows grew long. Winter was the hunger season, summer the season of abundance. For ancient people, to tell the time meant to read the sky. One of the first human attempts to mark hours was the sundial. Found in Egypt as early as 1500 BCE, sundials used the shadow of a stick or stone to divide the day. As the sun moved, the shadow shifted, and people could approximate the hour. But sundials had limits. They worked only in daylight, only under clear skies. Night erased them. Clouds mocked them. Still, in the ancient world, they reigned supreme, set up in marketplaces and temples to regulate public life. Where the sun failed, water succeeded. The water clock, or clepsydra, measured time by the steady dripping of water from one vessel to another. Egypt, Greece, China, and Mesopotamia all used them. Judges in Athens measured speeches by clepsydra. When the water ran out, so did your time. Unlike sundials, water clocks worked at night. Their steady drip offered constancy, though accuracy remained crude. But they symbolized something new: time as flow, measurable, divisible, independent of nature. By the medieval period in Europe, time was often told not by personal devices but by bells. Monasteries divided their days into prayers, matins, lauds, vespers, each rung by bell towers. Villagers came to measure their lives by these rhythms. When the bell tolled, it was time to rise, to work, to eat, to pray. Noon was not 12 o'clock, but when the church bell said so. The sound carried across fields and towns, a communal heartbeat of time. For peasants, the body itself told time. The crow of roosters, the buzzing of bees, the cry of children hungry for supper, these were clocks enough. Tasks also divided the day: milk the cows at dawn, fetch water at midday, mend clothes at dusk. For many, time was not measured but done. The day was a series of actions, not numbers. In diaries and letters, people wrote not at 6 a.m., but when the sun rose, or after the first meal. Their clocks were life itself. Imagine a farmer in 1200. He wakes at sunrise, prays when the bell tolls from the village church, eats when the shadow on his wall reaches a certain mark. In the afternoon, he gauges how long to work by the length of his shadow on the ground. When twilight comes, he stops. His day has no minutes, no ticking hands, only the pulse of light, sound, and hunger. Before clocks, time was not an enemy or a master. It was a companion, measured in shadows, water, bells, and breath. It shaped life gently, unevenly, without the sharp tick of machinery. But what changed when humans sought to discipline time? How did mechanical clocks transform not only daily life but the very way we think about time itself? The world once moved with shadows and bells. But humans are restless, always seeking precision, always demanding more control. And so, from monasteries to marketplaces, a new invention emerged that would reshape the human relationship with time: the mechanical clock. The earliest push for precise timekeeping came not from merchants or kings, but from monks. Monasteries divided their days into prayers known as the canonical hours: matins, prime, vespers, compline. Bells had to be rung at specific intervals. But shadows and water clocks were unreliable. Clouds hid the sun, water froze in winter. By the 13th century, European monasteries began experimenting with weight-driven mechanisms that rang bells automatically. These early mechanical clocks were crude, lacking faces or hands. Their sole purpose was rhythm, to call monks to prayer without fail. In this way, time itself became sacred machinery. From monasteries, clocks spread to towns. By the 14th century, great mechanical clocks were installed in church towers and civic buildings. These weren't personal devices, they were public spectacles. In Milan, Paris, and London, townspeople gathered to hear the bells chime the hours. Markets opened and closed by the sound. Courts began at certain strikes. Time was no longer just natural, It was civic. Many clocks displayed astronomical movements as well, the sun, moon, and zodiac circling across painted dials. They were not just machines, but wonders, symbols of human mastery over the heavens. As trade expanded, merchants embraced clocks. Contracts began to specify hours, not just days. Meetings were scheduled at the third hour instead of after sunrise. Ships departing ports were timed more carefully, and debts were tracked with sharper deadlines. Time became money. Where once farmers worked until dusk, merchants now demanded punctuality. A late shipment was no longer excused by the sun was slow to rise. The bell tower had spoken. Time was measured, not felt. The spread of clocks also transformed labor. Guild workshops began at set hours. Apprentices learned to arrive when bells tolled, not simply when the light allowed. Factories were centuries away, but already the clock was teaching discipline. The idea of wasting time emerged. Before clocks, time was simply life. After clocks, it became a resource, something to be used well, spent wisely, or lost. Picture a town square in 1350. The new clock tower looms above, gears clanking inside. At the strike of the bell, market stalls open. Judges call court. Children are pulled from play to attend lessons. The rhythm is no longer the sun's, but the tower's. Villagers glance upward, trusting the machine. Some marvel at its order. Others grumble that life now feels narrower, harsher, bound by sound. Yet all obey. The bell is too loud to ignore. Clocks quickly became symbols of authority. Cities competed to build the most elaborate towers, their bells declaring dominance. Wealthy patrons commissioned intricate mechanisms, blending art and engineering. To own time was to own people. The ringing bell was not suggestion but command. When it struck, the city moved. Kings and bishops understood. Control time, and you control life. Yet clocks also inspired awe and suspicion. To some, they seemed magical, machines that imitated the heavens. Chroniclers described them as marvels, comparing them to divine creation. Others whispered unease. Were humans challenging God by making their own heavens tick? Still, fascination won. The ticking of gears became the heartbeat of civilization. Mechanical clocks did more than measure hours. They reshaped society, binding prayer, trade, and labor to the rhythm of gears. Where once time was fluid, local, and lived, it became strict, public, and mechanical. But what happened next? How did clocks leap from towers into homes, pockets, and wrists? And how did this shift from communal time to personal time transform the way individuals lived their lives? The first clocks tolled for monasteries, then for cities. But soon, time moved inward. No longer confined to towers, clocks crept into households, shops, and pockets. And with them came a profound transformation. Time was no longer just public rhythm, it became private obligation. By the 16th century, wealthy households began acquiring mechanical clocks. These were not yet portable. They were large, ornate pieces, often decorated with brass and woodwork. To own one was to display wealth and modernity. The household clock changed domestic life. Meals, prayers, and chores could now be scheduled with precision. Families no longer relied solely on bells from afar. The discipline of hours was drawn into the home, binding even private life to the machine's tick. In the 16th and 17th centuries, advances in miniaturization produced the first pocket watches. German inventor Peter Henlein is often credited with early designs, using coiled springs instead of heavy weights. Suddenly, time was personal. A merchant could carry hours in his coat. A nobleman could consult minutes in the palm of his hand. Punctuality shifted from community expectation to individual virtue. To be late was no longer excused by, the bell didn't ring. You had no excuse. Pocket watches became status symbols. To pull one out was to display refinement, wealth, and control over life itself. As navigation grew critical for empires, clocks were pushed to new levels of precision. The invention of the pendulum clock by Christian Huygens in 1656 improved accuracy dramatically. Later, John Harrison's marine chronometers in the 18th century allowed sailors to calculate longitude, solving one of the great challenges of exploration. Time was no longer just for prayer and trade. It became empire's tool, guiding ships across oceans, binding colonies to capitals. The world itself began to tick in unison. While pocket watches dominated for centuries, the wristwatch gained prominence in the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in war. Soldiers needed quick access to time during battles, and the convenience of a strapped watch proved invaluable. After World War I, wristwatches became fashionable for civilians too. Time had leapt from towers to pockets to wrists. No part of life escaped its gaze. Imagine a middle-class family in 1850. A brass clock sits on the mantel, ticking steadily. Children are told to study until the hands reach a certain hour. The father checks his pocket watch before leaving for the train. Even in the quiet of home, the machine dictates. Where once a rooster or shadow was enough, now every moment is marked, measured, and judged. Time has become discipline. By the 19th century, industrialization made clocks central to labor. Factory bells rang shifts with ruthless precision. Workers were fined for lateness measured in minutes. Railways demanded standardized time zones, replacing local rhythms with national schedules. The clock was no longer a guide. It was a master. Philosophers called it tyranny, the reduction of life to hours and minutes, the transformation of human bodies into machines running on the same schedule as gears. Yet beneath the ticking, traces of older time remained. Farmers still worked by seasons, sailors by stars, villagers by bells. And in moments of wakefulness at night, people still felt the ghost of the second sleep, the memory of a rhythm older than any clock. We live in mechanical time, but the body still remembers natural time. The story of timekeeping is the story of control. From shadows to sundials, bells to towers, pockets to wrists, each shift drew humanity deeper into precision. We gained order, navigation, empire. But we lost something too, the fluid, human rhythm of time as experience. So next time you glance at your phone or watch, ask yourself, are you measuring life, or is life measuring you? You stand in a medieval village at dusk. The air is heavy, clouds roll in, and thunder cracks in the distance. Suddenly, from the church tower, a deep bell tolls. Its sound carries across the fields, echoing against hills, vibrating in your chest. This is not a call to prayer. It is a weapon. For centuries, people believed bells could drive away storms, banish demons, and even calm the dead. To us, bells are quaint or ceremonial. To them, they were power, sound forged into protection. Bells are among the oldest instruments of civilization. The earliest bells appear in China around 2000 BCE, cast in bronze and struck for ritual and music. Their tones were thought to harmonize heaven and earth. From China, bells spread westward. Romans used small bells in temples, homes, and even baths. In early Christian Europe, bells became sacred tools, rung to call the faithful, to bless fields, and to frighten away spirits. By the Middle Ages, bell-making had become an art. Great foundries cast massive church bells, some weighing tons, their sound carrying for miles. Each bell was given a name, baptized, and treated as a living guardian of the town. Storms were terrifying in pre-modern life. Lightning destroyed churches, wind leveled crops, and thunder was heard as the anger of God. To fight back, priests rang bells during storms, believing the vibrations scattered demons riding the thunder. Inscriptions on bells often read, "Fulgura frango," I break lightning. Some bells were cast with holy water mixed into their metal. When storms threatened, villagers ran to the tower, hauling ropes to ring until the danger passed. It was dangerous work. Bell ringers sometimes died when lightning struck the tower. But still they rang, convinced the sound itself fought the storm. Beyond storms, bells were thought to ward off evil spirits. Travelers in rural Europe carried small bells on carts and animals, believing the jingling sound kept witches away. Monks rang bells over fields to bless harvests. In villages, the toll of a bell marked not just time, but protection, a sound barrier between life and chaos. For medieval villagers, bells structured existence. The day began with the morning bell, ended with the evening toll. Work paused at midday when bells rang. Bells announced births, marriages, and deaths. When plague swept towns, bells tolled endlessly, each ring a reminder of another life lost. Silence, in contrast, was terrifying. The absence of bells meant abandonment, emptiness, or defeat. Bells spoke in codes everyone understood. A slow, Heavy toll meant death. A rapid peal signaled fire. A rhythmic pattern called people to worship. In times of invasion, bells became alarms, rallying defenders. Each village knew its own bell language. To live in medieval Europe was to live in a world constantly punctuated by sound. Imagine a family huddled in a cottage during a storm. Rain lashes the roof, wind shakes the shutters. But then, from the church tower, the bell tolls, steady and deep. The father whispers that the storm will pass. The bell is driving it away. The children, frightened, clutch their blankets, soothed not by silence but by the bell's relentless roar. The bell was not just sound. It was shield, clock, and voice. It shaped the rhythm of days and guarded the nights. But what happened when bells rang not to ward off storms, but to mark death, war, and judgment? How did a sound meant for protection become also a sound of dread? The bell once rang to push away storms, demons, and chaos. But bells were never only protectors. Their sound also became reminders of frailty, of endings, of judgment. The same vibrations that comforted could also chill the blood. To live in a world ruled by bells was to live in constant conversation with mortality. In medieval Europe, death was rarely silent. When someone lay dying, the passing bell tolled, its sound warning the community to pray for the soul departing. After death, the death knell followed, slow, solemn strikes, each pause heavy with finality. Different tones told different stories. In England, tradition held that 3 slow tolls followed by quick strokes marked a man's death, while 2 slow tolls began the signal for a woman. Villagers listening knew instantly who had gone. The bell was not just a marker, it was an announcement to eternity. Each toll was a public acknowledgement, life here has ended. During plagues, bells became relentless. As bodies multiplied, tolls rolled through towns day and night. Survivors wrote of the maddening sound, each ring confirming another loss. Some towns silenced bells during outbreaks, fearing the constant sound deepened despair. Others rang them louder, believing the vibrations purified air or frightened demons of pestilence. Either way, the bell was always present, in mourning or in fear. Bells also served as weapons of urgency. When enemies approached, towers rang an alarm, their frantic rhythm summoning men to arms. In cities like Ghent or Florence, civic bells doubled as political voices, calling citizens to assemblies, strikes, or revolts. Revolutions were often signaled by bells. In Paris, the storming of the Bastille in 1789 was marked by church bells pealing in chaos. Bells were not neutral instruments, they were political, their sound shaping the destiny of cities. Beyond war and plague, bells carried spiritual weight. Church bells tolled on holy days, reminding people of sin and salvation. Midnight tolls often symbolized judgment, warning listeners of the thin line between life and damnation. In some traditions, the toll of a bell was thought to drive away demons from the soul of the dead. In others, it was a reminder to the living, your own time is ticking. The phrase, "for whom the bell tolls," captured this perfectly. When the bell rang, it rang not just for one death, but as a reminder that all lives were bound to the same end. Imagine being a villager in 1348, the year plague swept Europe. You hear the bell tolling each morning, slow and heavy. You count the strikes, knowing which neighbor is gone. By evening, the bell rings again. At night, the bell does not sleep. You pray, but each sound reminds you, tomorrow it may be for me. The bell is no longer shield. It is shadow. Modern life is quiet compared to the medieval soundscape. Then, bells dominated. They rang for hours, meals, markets, danger, prayer, storms, and death. The mind was never free of their command. This constant ringing created both community and anxiety. You always knew the rhythm of life around you. But you also could never escape reminders of mortality. The bell was society's conscience, and society's fear. The bell began as protection, but its sound became entangled with dread. Each strike could mean salvation or doom, prayer or plague, war or death. But bells were not only about endings. They also marked beginnings, births, weddings, celebrations. So how did these instruments, forged to ring fear and faith, also come to symbolize joy, unity, and memory that stretches into our own time? The toll of bells once warned of storms, demons, death, and war. But bells were never only grim. Their voices also carried joy, the pealing that marked marriages, victories, and holy days. In this way, bells lived double lives, mournful and jubilant, terrifying and comforting. They were instruments of contradiction, echoing the full spectrum of human emotion. From the Middle Ages onward, bells rang not only for danger but for delight. The birth of a royal heir, the coronation of a king, or the return of peace after war, all were greeted with joyous peals. Villages celebrated harvest festivals with bells ringing wildly, their sound carrying over fields as workers rejoiced in survival. Unlike the solemn toll of death, celebration bells rang quickly, often in complex patterns called changes. To hear them was to know something good has happened. Weddings became one of the most enduring associations with bells. Church bells rang as couples left the altar, symbolizing not only joy but protection against evil spirits. The belief lingered that demons hated the sound of bells, so a wedding peal was as much exorcism as celebration. In villages, the whole community listened. Even those not present at the ceremony felt included by the sound. Bells turned private unions into public events, woven into collective memory. As nations grew, bells became more than local voices, they became symbols of identity. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia became a rallying cry for American independence. Big Ben in London came to symbolize British endurance. Across Europe, great bells marked national pride, their sound broadcast on radio and later television. To hear a bell was to feel connected not just to a village, but to a people. Imagine Christmas morning in a 15th century town. Snow dusts rooftops, smoke curls from chimneys. Suddenly, the church bells erupt in joyful peals. Families smile, children laugh, villagers gather. The same bells that tolled funerals now announce rebirth and hope. The contrast was powerful. Bells taught people that life was both sorrow and celebration, death and joy, silence and sound. Part of the bell's power lies in its sound. A large bronze bell produces deep, resonant tones that vibrate through air and body. The sound lingers, overlapping in rich harmonics, filling not only ears but bones. To stand near a great bell is to feel its presence physically. This sensory depth gave bells spiritual weight. The sound seemed unearthly, as though heaven itself spoke. Even today, the vibration of bells can stir emotion beyond words. Though phones and alarms now structure life, bells still endure. Churches ring them at weddings, funerals, and holy days. Universities mark hours with them. Nations peal bells on anniversaries of war and peace. They no longer ward off demons, but they preserve memory. Their sound links us to centuries of ancestors who once lived by their command. What makes bells unique is their contradiction. They are instruments of dread and delight, announcing both plague and marriage, both war and peace. Few objects in history carry such dual weight. Perhaps this is why bells still move us. They remind us that life is not one note, but many: sorrow, joy, fear, and hope, all ringing together. The strange history of bells is not just about sound, but about meaning. Bells were weapons against storms, guardians of souls, heralds of death, alarms of war, and voices of celebration. They shaped human memory, marking both our darkest hours and our brightest moments. So next time you hear a bell, in a church tower, at a wedding, or even from a distant clock, listen closely. Ask yourself, is it warning, mourning, or rejoicing? Or is it, as always, all of these at once? You sprinkle it without thought, a pinch of salt on food, a casual act. But for most of history, salt was treasure. It preserved meat through long winters, kept fish edible for voyages, flavored otherwise dull bread, and healed wounds. Civilizations rose along its trade routes, armies marched for it, and cities built fortunes upon it. Salt was life itself. Without it, food spoiled, survival faltered. Too little salt in the body brought weakness, confusion, even death. Too much meant waste. And so this simple crystal, glistening like frost, became one of the world's most sought-after substances: white gold. Salt's first power was preservation. Before refrigeration, nothing kept food from rotting like salt. It pulled moisture from meat and fish, halting decay. Villages near coasts packed barrels of salted fish to feed armies inland. Hunters salted venison for winter. Sailors carried salted rations across oceans. A household with salt could survive scarcity. A household without it faced hunger. Salt was not seasoning, it was survival insurance. Beyond preservation, salt was vital for health. Human bodies require sodium to function, to move muscles, to balance fluids, to keep nerves firing. Ancient people may not have known the science, but they knew the craving. Salt was medicine for fatigue, weakness, and fainting. To give someone salt was to restore their strength. In some cultures, newborns were rubbed with salt to protect their health and purify their bodies. The connection between salt and vitality ran deep. Salt shaped some of humanity's earliest settlements. In China, wells and springs provided salt thousands of years ago. Egypt's deserts yielded salt for mummification, a practice that required enormous quantities. Along the Mediterranean, salt pans produced wealth for traders who carried it inland. In Africa, entire caravans of camels carried salt slabs across the Sahara. Salt from Tagaza and Tadeni in Mali was exchanged for gold, pound for pound. It was said that houses in those towns were built of salt blocks, more abundant than stone. Rome, too, built its empire on salt. The Via Salaria, the salt road, carried it into the city. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in part with salt, giving rise to the word salary. To be worth one's salt was no metaphor, it was literal value. Imagine a peasant family in 10th century Europe. Their meal is coarse bread, thin soup, perhaps beans. Without salt, the food is dull, hard to swallow. With a pinch, flavors sharpen, appetites wake. The family guards its salt carefully, measuring it like treasure. To spill it is unlucky, for every grain wasted is survival lost. The small pot of salt on their table represents more than taste. It is the difference between endurance and starvation. Salt's power made it sacred. In Judaism and Christianity, salt symbolized purity and covenant. Offerings in the Hebrew Bible required salt, and Jesus called his followers the salt of the earth. In Hindu rituals, salt represented preservation of life and was offered to gods. Superstitions grew around it too. Spilled salt was considered unlucky, a breach of order, hence the custom of tossing a pinch over the shoulder to ward off evil. Salt was not a luxury spice. It was necessity turned treasure, survival turned empire. From Egypt's deserts to Rome's roads, from African caravans to peasants' tables, it shaped life in ways so profound we barely notice them now. But what happens when necessity becomes power? How did rulers tax, control, and even spark wars over something as simple as salt? Salt sustained life, but its scarcity made it power. Whoever controlled salt controlled survival. Rulers taxed it, empires built roads for it, and rebels rose against its burden. To us, it is ordinary. To them, it was empire in a crystal. Rome's might was bound to salt. The Via Salaria, the salt road, linked coastal salt pans with the city. Salt fueled armies by preserving rations. Some historians even argue Rome could not have expanded without it. The word salarium, salt allowance, gave birth to our word salary. To be worth one's salt meant to deserve pay. China too built dynasties on salt. For over 2,000 years, emperors tightly controlled salt production and trade. The revenue funded armies and bureaucracy. Salt taxes became so central that some Chinese historians call it the empire's lifeblood. Taxation on salt often sparked unrest. In France, the gabelle, a salt tax, became one of the most hated levies in history. It required citizens to buy a fixed amount of heavily taxed salt from the king's monopoly. Peasants smuggled untaxed salt, risking prison or worse. The resentment brewed for centuries, feeding into the anger of the French Revolution. In India, British colonial authorities imposed strict salt laws, forbidding locals from producing their own. Instead, they were forced to buy heavily taxed salt from British sources. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi led the Salt March, walking 240 miles to the sea to defy the monopoly. A simple handful of sea salt became a global symbol of resistance. Across cultures, salt's control symbolized oppression. To fight for salt was to fight for survival itself. Salt's value created sprawling trade networks. In Africa, caravans carried slabs of salt across the Sahara, exchanging them for gold and slaves. In medieval Europe, towns like Salzburg, literally salt fortress, thrived on mining and trade. Venice built maritime dominance partly through controlling salt routes. Its fleets carried salt from the Mediterranean to northern markets, enriching the city-state beyond measure. Salt was so precious it sometimes served as currency. Traders in Africa valued salt so highly that blocks of it were traded pound for pound with gold. Entire cities grew around salt. Salzburg in Austria, Wieliczka in Poland, and Hallstatt in the Alps thrived on salt mining. These places became wealthy, their architecture and culture funded by the trade of white gold. Salt was not merely a resource. It was foundation stone, giving rise to settlements, economies, and traditions that endure today. Imagine a French peasant in the 1700s, slipping into the woods with a sack of illicit salt. He avoids patrols, knowing capture means prison. His family cannot survive without cheaper salt, and so he risks everything. Or picture an Indian villager in 1930, walking with Gandhi toward the sea, defying empire with bare feet and resolve. For them, salt was not seasoning. It was freedom. Armies marched for salt. During the American Civil War, Confederate forces guarded salt works fiercely, for without salt, their meat supplies would rot. Union troops targeted salt mines and works, knowing to starve an army of salt was to cripple it entirely. Napoleon, too, faced crises when his soldiers suffered from lack of preserved food, tied directly to salt shortages. Victory often depended as much on salt barrels as on cannons. Salt's power lay not only in survival but in control. Empires taxed it, merchants traded it, armies fought for it. Behind every grain was authority. Who could eat, who could march, who could live? But what happened when technology shifted, when refrigeration and global trade made salt ordinary again? Did it lose its power, or did it carry its symbolic weight into modern times? For millennia, salt shaped survival, wealth, and war. But history shifts. What was once priceless became cheap. What was once empire became kitchen staple. Yet even in decline, salt never disappeared. It simply changed roles, slipping from throne to table, from tax to tradition. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, refrigeration began to replace salt as the world's great preserver. Iceboxes, cold storage, and eventually electric refrigerators reduced the need for barrels of salted meat and fish. Industrial mining also made salt abundant. Vast underground deposits in the United States, Europe, and Asia were tapped, flooding markets with cheap supply. The crystal once worth its weight in gold became available in sacks at the grocer. Empires no longer taxed it as treasure. Smuggling and wars over salt faded into memory. White gold had become white dust. But salt retained symbolic power. In Christianity, it remained tied to purity. Baptismal water was sometimes blessed with salt, and bread with salt was shared as sacred hospitality. In Judaism, salt is dipped with bread at Sabbath meals, echoing ancient covenants. In Hinduism, salt is used in cleansing rituals and offerings to deities. In folklore, salt carried protective power. To spill it was unlucky. To toss it over the shoulder was to blind lurking demons. Salt at thresholds kept away evil. Even in an age of science, people still clung to salt as more than mineral, as meaning. The memory of salt lives in words. To call someone worth their salt recalls Roman pay. To take with a grain of salt echoes ancient wisdom against deception. To be salt of the earth honors purity and humility. Salt seasons not only food but speech, carrying its history quietly in language. Picture a Russian family in the 19th century greeting guests with bread and salt. To offer both together was the deepest sign of welcome. Bread for sustenance, salt for preservation. The ritual said, "You are safe here, you will not hunger, you are honored." Even in cultures where salt lost economic value, it remained social treasure. Today, most salt is not even eaten. It is used in vast quantities for de-icing roads, softening water, and producing chemicals like chlorine. Mountains of salt sit in storage, reminders that abundance has erased old scarcity. And yet, in kitchens, the smallest pinch remains essential. A soup without salt is dull, bread without salt is flat. The body still craves what empires once hoarded. Though salt is cheap now, its history lingers in museums, in rituals, in national myths. Gandhi's Salt March remains a symbol of defiance. The gabelle is remembered as one of France's most hated taxes. Cities like Salzburg still bear its name. Every time we casually spill, sprinkle, or toss it, we echo centuries of struggle, survival, and reverence. Salt's story is one of transformation. It began as survival, rose to empire, fell into ordinary abundance, and survived in language, ritual, and memory. The crystal in your hand today is cheap, but it carries the weight of wars, revolutions, caravans, and prayers. It is history you can taste. So next time you add a pinch to your meal, pause and ask, are you seasoning food or savoring the ghost of white gold? Imagine walking through a medieval city. The streets are narrow, the gutters overflow with waste, and the air carries a heavy stench of smoke, animals, and unwashed bodies. Bathhouses, once common in Roman times, have long vanished or fallen into suspicion. Washing too often is considered dangerous, even sinful. And yet, in corners of workshops and monasteries, another tradition quietly survives: the making of soap. Bars of coarse, foul-smelling soap, made from animal fat and ashes, are sold to wash clothes, scrub floors, and, occasionally, clean bodies. Soap was not glamorous. It was harsh, expensive, and often distrusted. But hidden in its lye and grease was the beginning of a revolution in human health. Soap is older than it seems. Archaeologists have found evidence of soap-like substances in Babylon as early as 2800 BCE, mixtures of fats and ashes used for cleaning wool and cloth. The Romans perfected recipes, combining animal fat with lye to make solid soap. Bathhouses in Rome used oils and scrapers more than soap, but laundry workers relied heavily on it. After Rome's fall, soap-making knowledge lingered in monasteries and among Arab chemists. By the 7th century, Arabic texts described methods for making soap with olive oil, creating cleaner, more fragrant versions than Europe's tallow blocks. Cities like Aleppo became famous for their green, laurel-scented soap, exported across the Mediterranean. In Europe, soap was rough and functional. Made from pig fat or beef tallow mixed with ash, it was gray, smelly, and often caustic. Most households used it only for laundry or scrubbing floors. To use it on skin was rare, not only because of cost but because of fear. Medieval Europeans believed that bathing opened the pores, allowing disease to slip inside. Better to stay covered, dry, and scented with herbs or perfumes than to risk washing too often. Soap, therefore, was a household tool more than a personal one. Bathhouses did exist in the Middle Ages, but their reputation was mixed. Some were places of genuine cleanliness and relaxation. Others became associated with immorality, indulgence, and disease. As plague swept Europe in the 14th century, many blamed public baths for spreading infection. Cities closed them, declaring that water carried sickness. Cleanliness shifted from water to clothing. People changed shirts more often instead of bathing, believing linen absorbed impurities. Soap was used to scrub garments, not skin. Imagine a soap maker in 13th century France. The workshop stinks of boiling fat and caustic ash. Wooden vats bubble with lye, animal grease melting into thick paste. The air burns the lungs, hands sting from contact. Bars are poured into molds, cut roughly, and sold in markets. Housewives buy them to wash linens in cold rivers, beating clothes against stones. Children complain at the smell. Yet without these bars, filth would be worse. Soap is not glamorous, but it is survival. Soap in the medieval world was paradoxical, a tool of cleanliness in a culture that distrusted bathing. It scrubbed clothes and homes, but rarely skin. It was crude, expensive, and unglamorous, yet it held the seed of a transformation that would one day save millions of lives. But how did this shift happen? How did soap move from foul-smelling blocks for laundry to fragrant bars celebrated for health, purity, and even beauty? Soap lingered for centuries on the margins, used for laundry, cleaning tools, sometimes for the body, but rarely celebrated. Fear of water and distrust of bathing kept it from spreading widely. And yet, as plague swept cities, as medicine advanced, and as trade flourished, soap began its slow climb from suspicion to necessity. By the 16th century, attitudes toward bathing began to shift. Perfumes and scented waters gained popularity, especially in courts. Though people still feared immersion, they began to prize the appearance of cleanliness. Wealthy households imported finer soaps from Italy and the Middle East, Castile soap from Spain, Aleppo soap from Syria. These soaps were softer, gentler, and scented with herbs or oils. To own them was to show refinement. They were luxuries, more cosmetic than hygienic, but they paved the way for soap's respectability. Epidemics forced Europeans to reconsider filth. During outbreaks of plague, typhus, and smallpox, authorities began to emphasize sanitation. Though germ theory was unknown, people linked dirt and disease. Soap entered medical advice as a tool to cleanse homes, wash clothes, and sometimes scrub the body. Hospitals began using soap more systematically. Doctors and midwives, once indifferent to washing, slowly recognized its importance. The association of soap with health, not just vanity, was born. The real breakthrough came with industry. In the 18th century, chemical advances made soap cheaper and more effective. Nicolas Leblanc's process for producing soda ash lowered costs, while large-scale factories in France and England began mass-producing soap. By the 19th century, soap was no longer a luxury. It was marketed as a necessity for every household. Advertisements declared soap the defender of families, the guardian of health. For the first time, cleanliness was framed as a civic duty. Yet old fears persisted. Many still believed frequent bathing weakened the body. Doctors in the 18th century sometimes advised against immersion for the sick. Instead, they recommended partial washing, with soap applied sparingly to hands, face, and clothes. Slowly, however, urban life forced change. Crowded factories, dirty streets, and rising disease made personal hygiene harder to ignore. Reformers argued that a clean workforce was healthier and more productive. Soap became not only medicine but economics. Cleanliness also became a marker of class. To be dirty was to be poor. To be clean was to be respectable. Middle-class families prized neat homes, scrubbed children, and fresh-smelling linens. Soap manufacturers seized this, marketing their products as keys to social mobility. Wash and rise. Laundry days became rituals, with boiling tubs of water, heaps of soap, and hours of labor. Though exhausting, the work was tied to pride. A family with clean clothes was a family with dignity. Picture a Victorian woman in 1850. She rises before dawn, hauling water to heat in great kettles. Bars of harsh soap are grated into the boiling tub. She scrubs shirts and sheets until her knuckles are raw. Steam fills the room, the smell of soap and sweat mingling. Her work is backbreaking, but when the linens dry white on the line, she feels pride. Cleanliness is no longer just survival. It is morality, respectability, a place in society. And soap is at its center. Soap rose from suspicion to necessity because the world forced it to. Epidemics, industry, and class reshaped its meaning. Once feared as dangerous, it became weapon, symbol, and duty. But the greatest transformation was still to come, when science uncovered germs, and soap shifted from household tool to global lifesaver, protecting millions from disease. By the 19th century, soap was no longer luxury or suspicion. It was common, marketed, and tied to social respectability. But its greatest transformation came not from fashion or economy, it came from science. When germs were discovered, soap shifted from cosmetic to life-saving, from household item to global necessity. In the mid-19th century, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch revealed that disease was caused not by bad air, but by microbes. Suddenly, the act of washing gained new meaning. It removed invisible killers. Doctors like Ignaz Semmelweis proved that hand-washing with soap reduced maternal deaths in hospitals. At first, his advice was mocked. But when evidence grew undeniable, the medical world embraced soap as its simplest and most powerful defense. What was once superstition became science. Soap could save lives. Governments and reformers seized on this discovery. Campaigns urged citizens to wash hands, scrub homes, and keep children clean. Posters declared, "Soap is cheaper than doctors." In schools, children were taught hygiene as moral duty. In factories, soap was distributed to workers. During epidemics of cholera and influenza, public health officials pushed soap as frontline defense. Cleanliness was no longer just respectability, it was patriotism, responsibility, survival. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, soap companies transformed marketing. Pears Soap in England advertised cleanliness as beauty, linking washing with purity and whiteness. Lever Brothers, later Unilever, promoted Sunlight soap as a revolution for housewives, promising less labor and more hygiene. Soap ads spread into newspapers, posters, and magazines, turning bars of fat and lye into symbols of progress and civilization. In colonies, European powers even marketed soap as a civilizing tool, a darker chapter where hygiene was tied to imperialism and racial hierarchy. The bar of soap was no longer just product. It was ideology. World wars reinforced soap's status. Soldiers were issued soap as standard equipment, vital for preventing disease in trenches and camps. Posters urged civilians to save soap for the war effort. Soap factories turned into strategic industries, producing not only hygiene products but also glycerin, extracted from soap making, used in explosives. Even in war, soap meant survival. Picture a 1920s kitchen. A mother tells her children to wash hands before supper, echoing government campaigns. A bar of white soap rests by the sink, its scent sharp and clean. Upstairs, laundry day is eased by flakes of packaged soap, replacing old blocks. Soap is no longer harsh, smelly, or rare. It is fragrant, familiar, woven into every corner of life. A sign of progress, of safety, of modernity. Today, soap is so common it is invisible. Supermarkets line shelves with dozens of varieties. Antibacterial, moisturizing, scented, unscented. Yet its impact remains enormous. Hand-washing is still one of the cheapest, most effective tools against disease. Campaigns during the COVID-19 pandemic echoed Semmelweis's old lesson: wash your hands, save lives. Soap also survives in ritual. From baptismal blessings to symbolic offerings, it carries spiritual as well as physical weight. The irony is sharp. Once, people feared bathing and distrusted soap. Now, we fear not having enough of it. In times of crisis, from pandemics to war, soap vanishes first from shelves, proof of how deeply it is tied to survival. The story of soap is the story of human progress. From foul-smelling tallow blocks to fragrant bars, from suspicion to salvation, from laundry to hospitals, it shaped survival more than kings or conquests. So next time you lather your hands, pause and think. You are not just washing. You are repeating a ritual that has saved more lives than most medicines, a ritual born from ashes and fat, mistrust and fear, persistence and science. The bubbles on your hands are history's quiet triumph. Imagine a medieval night. The fire has burned low, your family lies on straw mattresses, and darkness fills the cottage. You drift to sleep not expecting 8 unbroken hours, but a rhythm older than clocks. First sleep, then waking, then second sleep. For centuries, across Europe and beyond, this pattern was normal. People went to bed a few hours after dusk, slept for 3 or 4 hours, then woke in the middle of the night. They prayed, talked, ate, even visited neighbors. After an hour or two of wakefulness, they returned to bed for a second sleep, rising at dawn. This segmented sleep shaped daily life, a rhythm now lost in our electric, clock-bound world. Historical records brim with references. Medieval texts mention first sleep and second sleep as casually as we mention lunch and dinner. In 1697, the French doctor Laurent Joubert wrote of peasants who take the first sleep, then spend an hour in reading or talking, then return to bed. In English court documents, witnesses described crimes occurring after the first sleep. Literary works, from Chaucer to Cervantes, refer to it without explanation, proof that everyone knew the pattern. Even medical advice recommended it. Doctors suggested waking between sleeps was the best time for study, prayer, or even conception. Segmented sleep arose from natural conditions. Without electric light, nights were long, especially in winter, stretching 14 to 16 hours in northern Europe. Few could sleep unbroken through such length. Instead, bodies settled into 2 phases, divided by a period of calm wakefulness. This rhythm suited agrarian life. The waking period gave time for quiet chores, reflection, or intimacy. Unlike today's insomnia, it was not anxiety but routine. People expected to wake in the night. This waking period had many names: the watch, the midnight waking, the interval. It was often peaceful, almost meditative. Families whispered stories, stoked fires, or prepared food for the coming day. Priests recommended prayers during the watch, calling it sacred time. Neighbors sometimes visited each other, carrying lanterns through dark streets. Letters describe villagers chatting in kitchens at midnight before returning to second sleep. Midnight was not silence, but a softer kind of living. Picture a farmer's household. The family goes to bed shortly after dusk, exhausted from labor. Around midnight, they stir naturally. The father tends the fire, the mother spins wool by lamplight, the children whisper. After an hour, yawns spread. They crawl back beneath blankets and sink into second sleep until dawn. The rhythm feels natural, expected. To them, 8 unbroken hours would have seemed strange. For centuries, the night was not a block of silence but 2 acts, with a waking interlude. It was as ordinary then as electricity is to us now. But what happened to this rhythm? How did the coming of street lamps, clocks, and factories erase the second sleep from memory, leaving us to believe one long stretch was normal? For centuries, segmented sleep was ordinary. But human habits bend under the weight of invention. Candles, lanterns, gas lamps, and electricity stretched the day beyond the sun setting. Factories demanded punctual labor. Cities reshaped the rhythm of night. Slowly, the quiet watch between first and second sleep vanished. The first cracks appeared with candlelight. For most peasants, candles were too costly to burn nightly, but wealthier households extended their evenings. Merchants tallied accounts, nobles read letters, scholars wrote past dusk. With light came productivity, and the temptation to stay awake longer before first sleep. Clocks reinforced this change. As timekeeping grew more precise in the 17th and 18th centuries, daily life became bound to the tick of gears rather than the flow of shadows. The watch became less useful. Why pause in the night when clocks demanded rising at dawn for work? Urbanization accelerated the shift. By the 18th century, cities glowed with lanterns and, later, gas lamps. Streets once deserted at midnight bustled with taverns, markets, and entertainments. Night became social instead of sacred. Those who had once woken naturally between sleeps now stayed awake later into the evening, collapsing into bed closer to midnight. The interval between sleeps shortened, then disappeared. The final blow came with industrialization. Factories ran on strict schedules. Workers rose early, labored long shifts, and returned home exhausted. Employers demanded punctuality, measured in minutes and seconds. Sleep had to fit the working day, not the body's rhythm. Medical advice began to change too. By the 19th century, physicians promoted the idea of one continuous, restorative sleep. Insomnia was reframed as disorder rather than natural wakefulness. The second sleep was forgotten, rebranded as pathology. Imagine a factory worker in 1850. He rises before dawn, works 12 hours among machines, and returns home drained. By the time he eats and collapses into bed, there is no energy for waking between sleeps. His rest becomes one long stretch, demanded by the whistle that will rouse him again at dawn. The body may still stir in the night, but culture has shifted. To wake at midnight now feels like failure, not normalcy. Ironically, modern science has confirmed what the past knew. When people live without artificial light, their sleep often reverts to 2 phases. Experiments in the 20th century placed volunteers in dark rooms for weeks. After days, their sleep naturally broke into 2 segments, with an hour or 2 of peaceful wakefulness between. Our ancestors were not strange. They were simply natural. It is we who have bent ourselves to machines. The second sleep did not vanish overnight. It faded under the pressure of light, clocks, and labor until it seemed alien, even laughable. We came to believe in one continuous stretch as normal, forgetting centuries of a softer, segmented rhythm. But what traces remain? How do echoes of second sleep still appear in insomnia, in midnight creativity, in our restless tossing at 2 a.m.? The second sleep faded from daily life, erased by light bulbs, factory whistles, and ticking clocks. Yet the body remembers. Even now, in the 21st century, midnight restlessness and sudden wakefulness whisper of a rhythm older than industry, a rhythm of first sleep, the watch, and second sleep.